Alright, this is another one of our videos covering one of the core concepts of genetics that we need in order to understand all these processes. So in this video I wanted to talk about the terms dominant and recessive, what they mean, and how we can use our understanding of dominance or recessive to determine the relationship for traits that we're studying. So let's start with some definitions. So let's look at a textbook definition for dominant and recessive and see if we can use that to help us figure out what how these terms relate to one another. So if you look up the term dominant in the textbook, we'll see something like this. Dominant describes a trait that masks the expression of another trait when both versions of the gene are present in an individual. So at this point in our understanding of genetics, that might be hard to understand. So we'll look at the definition of recessive, and then we'll go through some examples and think about what these definitions mean. All right, so that's dominant. What about recessive? Recessive describes a trait whose expression is masked by another trait when the alleles for both traits are present in an individual. So here the key differences are that we're looking at one trait, the dominant one, that does the masking. It masks the expression of another trait. That trait is the recessive one. Recessive traits are masked by another trait, the dominant one. So dominant and recessive traits, they have this relationship with one another where the dominant trait hides the recessive trait. So let's look at some examples and think if we can build a good understanding of these definitions. So Mendel taught us about dominant and recessive traits. Again, when Mendel looked at his pea plants, he studied these 7 traits, whether or not the seeds were round or wrinkled, whether or not the seeds were yellow or green, whether the flowers were white or purple, etc. And for each of these traits, Mendel investigated these 2 forms. And he determined which of the 2 forms was dominant and which of the 2 forms was recessive. So let's think about how Mendel determined that relationship. So let's use one of those traits as an example. And we're going to use seed color. So Mendel had plants that were either green seeded or yellow seeded. And what Mendel did is he wanted to understand how these 2 traits, versions of this trait, the color of the seed, related to one another. So Mendel took some pea plants that had only green seeds, and he mated them to pea plants that had only yellow seeds. And then Mendel looked at the offspring of that cross. And when we look at the offspring of this cross, Mendel saw that the only trait we observe is yellow seeds. So in this experiment, Mendel found out that the yellow trait was hiding the green trait. So if we take green and yellow and combine them together, we only get yellow. Yellow hides or masks green. So all of the progeny had yellow seeds, and that helped Mendel determine that yellow seeds were dominant. So for this particular example, yellow seeds ended up being dominant over green seeds. And one of the points I want to make is that there was no way to predict that just based on the characteristic itself. Mendel had to do an experiment to determine which of those traits was dominant and which was recessive. So if yellow is dominant, green is the trait that is being masked. It's the recessive trait. So Mendel did that exact kind of experiment for every single one of these traits that he was looking at. He would take, for example, round seeds, mate them to wrinkle-seeded plants, and see which came out as dominant. So we know for the seed color, yellow ended up being the dominant form. But which form was dominant for round and wrinkled? So again, he took round-seeded plants, mated them to wrinkled-seeded plants, and determined what the progeny had, which trait masked the other. And for that, he found that round seeds were dominant. He did the same experiment for white flowers and purple flowers. In that case, purple flowers were dominant. He did that for the shape of the seed pod, this full shape versus this constricted shape. In that case, full seed pods was dominant. He looked at the color of the seed pods. There, green is dominant. He looked at the placement of the flowers, whether they're axial or terminal at the ends. He found that axial was dominant. And then for the size of the plant, he found that tall plants were dominant. So again, the point I want to make here is there was no way for Mendel to predict which of these traits would be dominant or recessive. He had to do an experiment to determine that. So after Mendel determined this, he began using symbols to represent the versions of the genes. He used different letters to signify the different forms of the trait, or what we'll call alleles. Right? So when we use these symbols, uppercase letters are going to designate the dominant form of the trait, while lowercase letters will represent the recessive form of the trait. And so there are three combinations. And for the yellow seeds, we'll use yellow seeds as an example. We'll use Y as the letter to represent the gene. So uppercase Y will be yellow, lowercase y will be green. Here we have three combinations. You could have two dominant alleles, one dominant and one recessive, and two recessive alleles. In our video about phenotype and genotype, we talked about these three different genotypes. And today we're going to talk more about this heterozygous genotype. Heterozygous is when the two alleles are different from one another. So it's those heterozygous individuals that allow us to determine which is the dominant phenotype. So this is a really important point I want to make. In genetics, the only way to determine if a trait is dominant is to observe which trait shows up in a heterozygous individual. So you have to do an experiment. You can't predict it. There is no way to look at the trait and determine which is dominant or recessive. You have to create a heterozygous individual and see which form of the trait they have. Do they have yellow seeds or green seeds? If the heterozygous individual, the individual containing both of the different alleles, has yellow seeds, we know the yellow seed is dominant. So let's look at our example again. Mendel took green seed plants, mated them to yellow seeded plants, and got out all yellow seeded progeny. So again, we can use symbols to represent that. Since we got out all yellow seed progeny, we know yellow is dominant. And so the yellow plant will give the uppercase Y alleles to. The green plant will give the lowercase y alleles to. And when we cross these two plants together, the progeny get one of the y's from each parent. So from the yellow parent, we'll get an uppercase Y, and from the green parent, we'll get a lowercase y. So we get two different y's, heterozygous, and we see that that individual is yellow. Yellow is dominant over green. Green is recessive. And again, we're using these symbols where uppercase Y represents the yellow allele, lowercase y represents the green allele. All right, so let's think about one more example before we end. So there's another trait that has two forms, where one is dominant and the other is recessive. This trait is called polydactyly. Polydactyly is when an individual is born with more than 5 digits. So in this x-ray, we can see a hand that has 6 digits on that hand. So that's an individual with polydactyly. And then on the right, we've got an x-ray of an individual with normal number of digits, just 5. So the question becomes, which form of this trait is dominant? Is having 5 digits dominant, or is having 6 digits dominant? Again, we cannot tell just by looking at the trait. So here I'm going to assign some allele symbols to these two traits. For the 6-digit hand, I'm going to say, let's assume this person is homozygous for this trait. And so they have 2 of these alleles that lead to 6 digits. So I'm using D6 to represent the allele that gives 6 digits. So D6, D6, they're homozygous for this D6 allele. And our other individual is homozygous for having 5 digits. So there I'm using the D5 allele, D5, D5, homozygous for 5 digits on their hand. All right, so in order to determine which trait is dominant, we have to cross these two people together. So we'll take a male with 6 digits, a female with 5 digits, we'll mate them together, and then we look in the offspring. Their offspring will be heterozygous because they're going to get one allele from each parent. So one D6 from dad, one D5 from mom. So we'll have a mix. We have a heterozygous individual. Then all we have to do is look at the individual. This individual has 6 digits. So we've learned that in a heterozygote, they have 6 digits. That tells me that having 6 digits is dominant. So that we just learned polydactyly is dominant. Okay. If we wanted to switch now from using these allele annotations, D5 and D6, we could now use the uppercase and lowercase letters to represent the trait. So at this point, I could use an uppercase D to represent the 6-digit trait, which is polydactyly. And the lowercase, that should be a D, the lowercase d to represent 5 digits. So let's summarize. So dominant traits hide the presence of a recessive trait. When you have both of them together, one allele of each, we will see the dominant phenotype. Okay. We can determine which trait is dominant only by looking at a heterozygote individual. So when we have both traits present, again, we'll observe the phenotype of the dominant trait. And then the last point I want to make before we end is about what dominant traits are not. So dominant traits are the traits that hide recessive traits. But what aren't dominant traits? Dominant traits are not better. Nothing about being dominant says that that trait is more beneficial. Okay? Dominant traits are not more common. You can think about that polydactyly trait. Have you ever met someone with 6 digits on their hand? It's a relatively uncommon trait. How common a trait is has nothing to do with whether it's dominant or recessive. Dominant traits are not stronger. Sometimes that's the way students describe dominance, that it's a stronger trait. That might be getting at how dominant traits hide the recessive trait, but dominant traits are not stronger. I sort of interpret stronger to again mean better. That's not the case. So there's lots of misconceptions that students have about dominant traits. And what I want you to take away from this video is that we can only determine which trait is dominant by doing an experiment and looking at a heterozygous individual and determining which version of the trait that heterozygous individual expresses. That is the dominant trait. So we'll end there. As always, let me know if you have questions, and I will talk to you again soon.